thank you for coming.
You're very welcome.
How do I pronounce your last name?
Carrier.
Carrier. So
Yeah,
just like it looks.
yeah. When I was more fluent in French, I would say Carriere, but I'm too embarrassed to use that now because I've lost a lot of my facility with the French language.
And you are a Canadian writer living in Hamilton, Ontario, but you're not from here. Where are you from?
Well, I grew up in Alberta. Then after high school, I left there for places far afield. And eventually, in the 1970, I ended up back in Ontario and stayed here ever since. Various places, mostly in Toronto and then up in the Bruce Peninsula, and then finally Hamilton.
So the Bruce Peninsula, this is the
Yeah,
book, and
yeah,
that's what you've written about.
right.
So you've traveled all over the place.
Yeah, did a lot of traveling.
Yeah, you did a stint with the Canadian military, correct?
Yeah, yeah. I sort of entered that profession reluctantly, encouraged by my father, and in some ways it was a blessing because I did get to travel at the government expense quite a bit. As a student in the military, I spent the whole summer in Europe, which was pretty cool. And I was only, oh gosh, 20 years old. Bought a Vespa scooter and traveled all over with my tent on the back, and it was pretty terrific.
So you've lived an adventuresome life.
Yeah.
What? When did you start writing?
Um, well, in the military, I was obliged to do a lot of writing because I had an administrative position. So it just became second nature to write reasonably well. But then I started journaling during my travels, actually as early as those travels in Europe on the Vespa in the 1960s. And actually, that journal I wrote in French because I was trying to improve my French. Now, because I was traveling light, they didn't have a grammar book with me, so I became very proficient at writing a journal in French quickly, but I probably made the same grammatical errors that I did in the beginning. And then I did another trip through Europe and then to the Far East in the late 60s, and I wrote a journal all the time and managed to get a couple articles printed in Manila Times when I landed there.
Oh
So
wow.
just so, and then I just continued. A lot of the stuff I wrote was pretty silly stuff, like children's poetry and stories, and along with the children, we just played a lot with words and images. And I think when the kids were 4 and 8, we produced our own little book,
Oh.
and it sort of inspired them to think that, hey, this is not so hard. We can do this too. So we
Oh,
just
so are they
continued on.
writers too?
Um, I would say they are not publishing a lot of stuff, but they're both proficient. Kelsey, she took environmental studies at York, and she took one course in creative writing, and she just aced it. She won the poetry prize for all of York University in her
Wow.
third year, and her professor attended her wedding and said, "I rarely give an A plus to anybody. Kelsey got an A plus every year." And Judd has just got a gift for writing too, but he hasn't formally published anything. He's just always
But do you think that what makes a writer? Is it writing or is it being published?
No, I think it's just doing it.
Yeah.
And publishing might be a byproduct of it, but I think what you want to do is just have fun.
Yes.
That's my aim anyway.
Yes.
And, and sometimes you don't care if anything you've written gets published as long as you've enjoyed the process.
Right. And your kids will have something. You
Yeah.
know? Yeah. So are you gonna read something from your book?
Sure, I'll read you a couple limericks. Um, okay, well, I'll tell you a little bit about the one that's featured on the front cover. There's a funny little place near Wyerton called Wolseley, and it's at the crossroads of four roads, of course, and there's only one building at that corner. It's an old rundown shack, and attached to it is a rundown trailer that was used as a variety store for the owners that lived there for years. But over time, I just saw it slowly sort of sink into the ground and into the ground, and eventually the people disappeared to somewhere. But kitty corner from it is a sheep farm. So I like the name of Wolseley, and so I wrote this limerick about it. On a farm near the village of Wolseley, the sheep won't wear wool, so you see, they wear silk and tall hats, leather shoes and red spats, with nothing else on except the breeze. So,
That's great. You can take something that it seems ordinary and turn it into something fun or interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I purposely chose all sorts of place names that were pretty unusual, and then used that as a starting point to write a story about it, right?
Right.
Okay. There's, I'll read you a couple others here. Well, I've always liked Newfoundland, but I've never been there. It's the only province I haven't been to yet. But, and I was thinking about this one. There's a newfie from Cabot Head, and I'll just do a little preamble to it. When I grew up in Alberta, for a short time I stayed with an uncle of mine on his farm, and we had cattle, of course. And when cattle are eliminating, often the elimination is rather syrupy, but eventually with the sun, it kind of hardens into what we call cow pies. So then I was tied that into Newfoundland. There was a newfie from Cabot Head, which is a place on the Bruce Peninsula, who was found in a field stone dead. How could he die from eating cod pie? He'd eaten cow pie instead.
Oh.
A little gross, but... And there's another one I'll read to you. And this stemmed from a book that I read years and years ago called Ferdinand the Bull. And I don't know if you're familiar with that book. It's a classic written in 1936, just before the Spanish Civil War. But it, in its offhanded way, preached pacifism. So the book was banned by Franco in Spain and banned in a lot of other countries. And then when Hitler came to power, he ordered all copies of that book to be burned, because, as he said, it was degenerate democratic propaganda. Well, I think all of that publicity around it helped to sell a lot of books. Like, it's been selling forever and still is in print.
Yeah, when you hear somebody wants to ban a book, that's cause to go out and read that book.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just a delightful book. It's So anyway, here's the limerick I wrote about that bull, and I placed him in the Bruce Peninsula at a place called Goring. It's an inconspicuous little place. There was a mad bull south of Goring, whom bullfight fans thought to be boring. He'd walk over the hill, take a sniff of fresh ale, and forget the matador he was goring.
So the play on words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Do you, in your normal day-to-day life, I mean, do you think like this? You play on words and have fun with things just day to day?
quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I've written like a lot of goofy children's poetry, which is sort of pretty off base, and the kids have sort of grown up into that too, and they do a lot of that as well. So
Right. Well, a sense of humor is always a good thing, isn't it?
yeah, it helps, especially during these crazy times.
Yeah. Yeah. Where can people get your book?
Probably the best thing now is just to email me.
Okay.
Dean Carriere at netscape.net,
Okay.
because we printed 79 copies, and it's sold out pretty quickly within weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So we just did that to test the market and decide if we're going to carry on any further and try to sell more. But and just probably out of interest to anyone self-publishing, we did it. Well, I shouldn't say we. My daughter and son organized it. It was a book launch, which was pretty amazing, and they combined it with sort of a blues band, and so they put out invitations, and then they cut it off at 100 people. That many had indicated had already purchased tickets, so we stopped at 100, and we ended up selling 40 books that night.
Terrific.
But,
Are they still available? They were in some bookstores in Bruce County, right?
no, we hadn't even got around to doing that yet.
Oh.
And partially looking at getting more copies printed, but we looked into Kindle through Amazon, and all three of us are a little bit reluctant to go through Kindle because Amazon has captured, from what I understand, about 50% of the book trade in the States.
Oh.
They're just, killed a lot of the small bookstore businesses.
Right.
So we're just in the process of getting a different quote from the one we had done in Toronto. There's a Hamilton firm that was interested in having a look at it, so that's in the process now.
Okay.
But the thing is, like, we sold a book at $20 each with no problem, but to get that into a bookstore, they're going to want, $5 or more dollars.
Yes.
And then,
And yeah, it doesn't cover the cost of the production.
It doesn't, just break even, that's it.
Yeah, I think that's a frustrating thing for some writers who don't want to go do a Kindle, is getting it produced at a reasonable cost, because you're not mass producing like the big publishers.
Yeah.
And the big publishers won't look at you if you don't have an agent.
Yeah, that's right.
And the agents are all booked up. Yeah.
So, getting back to my point earlier, you just do it for the sheer fun of it. And if you, just by some quirk of fate, it happens to take off and someone picks it up and, CBC touts it and all that stuff, you might just lock in. But I think the chances are kind of slim.
Yep.
And particularly for this book, it's site specific. It's
Yes.
Bruce County.
But for anyone who lives in or has visited Grey Bruce,
Yeah.
This is terrific.
Yeah, well,
Right?
friends up there that came around the table where I was sitting that night at the at the lodge were saying, "This is terrific. There's so many tourists up here." And I had a hard time believing it, but they claimed about 2 million tourists a year travel to Grey and Bruce. And so if you get it exposed in stores, it should sell. But then again, it's a question of
Production.
how much
Yes.
the
Yes.
store wants. And,
Yes. So, what advice would you give to people who are either considering starting to write or who are writing and are struggling or are maybe not sure of themselves? What advice would you give to other writers?
well, I would just do it. Just write. And write in such a way that gives you pleasure. You know, whether it's humorous stuff or something quite serious, and maybe some historical things that you're passionate about, just so you make yourself feel good about what you're doing.
Right.
And I think you gotta have that burning desire to put something out there that pleases you.
And so I guess the core message here is that what makes a writer is not being published. It's the act of writing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is not many Canadian authors make a lot of money.
No.
I heard someone being interviewed on CBC radio, and they claimed that the average full-time writer makes about 13,000 a year. So
If you're lucky.
yeah. So usually the person in that position has a spouse that has a good job, or because you can't survive if that's your sole source of income.
No.
Or not many can anyway.
And it's unreliable. You do the work and you don't know if it's going to get published or if you're going to get paid. Yes. Is there anything I have forgotten to ask you?
Well, I don't know if this is a wise advice for other writers, but certainly if you experience a lot of stuff, it gives you more fodder for your writing. And I don't know what compelled me from an early age, but I've always been fairly adventurous, and I hitchhiked a lot even when I was little, and I did absolutely bizarre stuff sometimes. Remember once I decided I was going to travel the Trans-Siberian Railway, so I thought, I better learn Russian. So I got a leave of absence from the military and went to U of T and studied Russian for 6 weeks. And then the course ended at noon, and because I liked hitchhiking and the characters one meets along the way, I decided to hitchhike from Toronto back to the air base where I was working, which was pretty crazy to do that on a weekend and be to work Monday morning. But a couple nurses approached me in the square just outside the school and said, we're going to Grand Bend for the weekend. How would you like to come with us? I didn't know these women. And I said, well, I can't. I'm going to hitchhike to beyond Winnipeg, right? He says, oh, come on, it'll be fun. So eventually I gave in. They said, look, it's Saturday morning, we'll drive you to the road, and then you can get going. Well, it was pretty risky because I would have been in trouble had I been late for work.
Yes.
But anyway, I started hitchhiking after a wonderful time with these two women, and I made it up to Gimli, north of Winnipeg, by dinner time on Sunday. I was leaving Saturday morning. I made it in 3 rides.
Wow.
So, I mean, when you have things like that under your belt as adventures, it gives you more like fodder, like I said earlier, for your writing.
It would also.
I ended up in the hospital in Mexico with a hernia after competing with some professional soccer players for a weekend, and I wasn't used to some of the exercises that they were doing, mountain running and stuff like that. So, fortunately, where I collapsed, I was with two friends, and there was a hospital attached to the university. So I got all patched up, and they were a terrific young couple traveling in their Volkswagen camper, and they had a Coleman stove. They sold popcorn at the local theater to raise some extra money to help me cover my train fare to the border.
Wow.
So they said, look, when you get to Tijuana, just head straight home. Well, I thought, well, I'll spend a couple of days in Tijuana before I start hitchhiking to Calgary, which I did, and I had great time, and then I had a wonderful time hitchhiking to Calgary, where I had some money in the bank. So, but when you put yourself in situations like that, I mean, you have sometimes some pretty incredible experiences.
Yeah, I bet.
Lends itself to some good writing if you choose to do that. There's a poet by the name of Bukowski, I forgot his first name, that my son put me onto, and he claimed unless you have a passion to write, there's no point doing it. And he said too, you could be just in 4 square walls of your room and you could create amazing stuff.
True.
If you've got the desire and of course the ability.
Thank you again for coming.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Lori.